A lot of you no doubt have already seen this video that you're watching right now on your screen showing an RPG re-weld go horribly wrong. It has brought up a lot of questions from one end of the internet to another, and I've been getting some of those, and frankly, I have some of those myself. Fortunately, I've got just the guy to contact. Joining me again today is Mike Kwiatkowski from FFLexpert.com, and we need to make it emphatically clear up front that we are in no way, shape, or form throwing rocks or stones at any of the people involved. We're not looking down our noses at them. We wish everyone involved a speedy recovery, Godspeed, but we want to pull this apart and use this as a doorway to go into some of the legal concepts and some of the practical concepts about what happened here, as well as in other cases. So guys, without further ado, let's get into it. So Mike, we've all seen the video that's been posted, and thank God it looks like he's going to be okay. But it got a lot of people asking the question of, is this legal? If so, how? What's the gateway? And I knew exactly the guy to call.
Well, thank you for having me back, Tom. I've seen that video. It was a very hot topic at the Small Arms Review show. And from a personal level, I want to extend my, frankly, congratulations at having survived it and my best wishes for a speedy recovery to the gentleman involved. I have been involved with similar firings. I narrowly avoided having something like that occur to me. And when I saw that video, it very much made me twist uncomfortably. But for the grace of God, go I.
So what are we looking at from a real kind of firearm perspective?
Well, from a real perspective, you had asked about the legalities, and yes, what they were doing was perfectly lawful. That would fall under a destructive device within the NFA, more specifically, a destructive device that has been reactivated and then registered either on a Form 1 or a Form 2. Perfectly lawful. I'm not going to say commonly done or done all the time, but in some of the circles I travel in, yes, it has been done, is done, and will continue to be done. But sometimes things don't go according to plan, and you have a catastrophic failure.
So when you're talking about reactivated,
yes,
in English, for people who are not necessarily gun people or people who they don't travel in these circles,
what that means is that the RPG in question was deactivated to U.S. specs. They would cut a hole in the high-pressure area, roughly equivalent to bore diameter, or it could be larger, a pin in place, and oftentimes the firing pin or firing pin channel gets slagged. And we will do things with reactivation where that hole will be patched over, the firing pin restored, the channel restored, and that block or pin removed, and fire the RPG again.
Would that be a Form 1?
A Form 1 for an individual, or a non-SOT, a Form 2 for a licensed manufacturer of destructive devices.
And I'd have to think that your weld work and so forth has better be up to snuff if you're going to be doing things like this.
Yes. And sometimes it is, many times it is, especially in these worlds. But as more people see other people doing things on YouTube, not always. And on a personal level, I've been there. Without naming names of people involved, I reactivated a US M18A1. That's a 57 millimeter recoilless rifle. And I had the welding originally done by someone who was brought to me as an expert in rewelding these recoilless rifles. The bell or the chamber area the center section was cut out. Now I had the original center section, which definitely helps, but it was rewelded, put back together. We made a new load for it, which is a story by itself. And on the first firing, the weld gave way. And that is it can be fired off of a 1917 tripod, or it can be fired off the shoulder. Had I fired it off the shoulder, we would not be here having this conversation today.
Yeah, that's a lot of plasma going into the neck, basically.
Neck, shoulder, plenty of areas that plasma should not go.
Right. Mm-hmm. So without commenting specifically on this particular video people are seeing, just kind of using it as a launching pad, if you will, what are issues that people need to be aware of if they're thinking about something like this?
I'm not going to touch the scientific portions. I'm not a scientist. But the first thing to understand is that steel is not always steel. You can have steel made in one particular environment at one particular historical time period next to another piece of steel which is from another area and from another part of history. For example, World War I versus Vietnam era steel. And if you're going to re-weld or put something back together, these two steels may have different compositions, different amounts of iron in them, for example. And somebody out there will know many more chemicals and ingredients in that steel than I could. They don't always play well together if you're welding them. The next thing is the weld itself. How is it done? Who did it? Is it any good for high pressure? Now, some people will say put a collar around it. For example, a ring of steel around the weld itself. Well, the first thing is that if you're doing it exterior, now you just made inspecting the welds as you use this firearm a little tougher. If it's inside, now you've just decreased the volume of that particular chamber. That may not end well. In the case of a recoilless rifle, it's a finely balanced equation. Half of the gas is out the front, half out the rear. Well, if you go and screw around with that equation and you're getting 60-40, it's not so recoilless anymore. The third thing are the parts involved. These are often weird parts, perhaps rejects that have ended up making their way to the commercial market. And if you're lucky, you can do a little bit of modification to them. For example, there's a little too much metal. Or maybe if you need to add a little bit of metal, you can touch a little bit of weld on it. But these are often shot out parts, questionable parts, parts that are out of spec. And now you're putting these on these high pressure and frankly very temperamental guns. And that's another thing I should add. RPGs, either 2 or 7, recoilless rifles, they are temperamental on their best days, made properly with factory spec ammunition. Another thing to consider is that ammunition. The original powder, if it's not been declared an explosive and impossible to get, is just going to be unobtainable. You're having to come up with your own mixtures. In my case, without giving out anything to help people in this project, I had to do a mixture of 1.1 pounds of IMR 5010, a certain type of black powder, and then instead of an artillery primer, I had to use a 50 caliber primer setting off a priming tube, which is essentially a very long piece of pipe that's perforated with holes and different black powders mixed in there. And then you take all that powder, that 50 cal powder and that black powder, put it into a bag and shake it around real good. And if anybody out there understands reloading, what I just described is probably making you shift uncomfortably in your seat. Now imagine putting a tube of 1.1 pounds of that next to your head in a reconstituted gun and touching it off. There is a reason that if you don't have religion, you're about to get it.
Yeah, I can imagine that, there's no atheists firing their reconstituted RPG for the first time, right?
Recoilless rifles, RPGs. And then on top of all that, let's talk about some of these projectiles. An RPG warhead, you generally don't see them out for sale except as dummies on the collector's market for a few $100s each. People aren't shooting those. They're doing 3D printing. Let's again talk the recoilless rifle. The weights involved are very precise. If you get the weight of the projectile wrong, suddenly that thing's not so recoilless anymore. So you have all these things separate going on. Well, tolerance stacking is real. That means each one is off by a few percent from the original. Perhaps it means nothing. But then you add on the percent from the next one, a few percent from the one after that, and so on and so forth. And all of a sudden, you have a recipe for disaster.
And that's assuming, of course, you can get the specs for everything originally. And is that something that's difficult to get when we start talking about Soviet-era RPGs and all that kind of stuff? And I have no idea if that's what, I mean, I don't know the first thing about what they used here. I'm just saying in general.
The specs can be found. The problem is that especially with Soviet equipment, what's the most common thing we joke about? Not to spec or good enough. And each one being a little different is a problem. So we've got our RPG that's been demilled. We knew it was temperamental on its best days. We're slapping on or welding on a patch. Maybe it's a good weld, maybe it's not. Maybe the steel is from the same era. Maybe it's some random steel from God knows where. We're putting the firing pin back in the channel. We are removing that pin. Now we're reconstituting a rocket. I'm not saying, and this is not a recommendation not to do these things, but you need to understand what you're dealing with and that, yes, it can and will go wrong. I will not look down my nose at any of the people involved in that incident. They did their best. That was an accident. Things happen. But what we need to appreciate, and what my goal here is to tell everybody that, yeah, these things do happen. When it comes to recoilless rifles, RPGs, and even though they're a non-gun in 49 of the 50 states, flamethrowers, you need to be extraordinarily careful with these, especially when they're reconstituted. Even uncut original C&R guns, these things were temperamental on their best days. And here we are reactivating them after they've been cut up, and Lord knows if the heat treatment is even correct anymore, because they're not just simple cuts. They're cuts with a cutting torch.
Well, Mike, we appreciate you coming in and giving at least me a crash course. Hopefully people down the lens got something out as well.
Thank you. And again, we're not looking down our noses on those involved. I wish them all the best. And I do wish for their very rapid and quick healing. But for those who are out there considering this, I'm not going to tell you not to do it. I'd be a hypocrite. I've done it. Many of my friends do it. Just understand that this is very different than putting together either an AR-15 from an 80% kit or even putting together your own bolt-action rifle. This is a lot more dangerous and requires a lot of research.
We appreciate that. And of course, if you're trying to find Mike, if you're an FFL, an SOT, if you're a manufacturer, you've got issues, questions regarding ATF compliance, or whatever the case may be sure to check him out at fflexpert.com. Mike, thanks for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for sticking around this long in the video. And again, if you've not already done so, be sure to hit that like button. It's the best way to show your support, not only for this channel, not only for Mike coming in, but also, of course, for the Second Amendment. Again, our hearts go out to all those involved. Best of luck, speedy recovery, and let's close with our quote of the day. This one comes from Albert Camus. Nothing is more despicable than respect based on fear. Thanks for sticking around. We will see you in the next one. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. If you enjoyed this one, please feel free to check out some of our other great content, and we'll see you in the next one.